Welcome to our fifth lecture of our 2019-2020 Art Studios Visiting Artist Lecture Series, and our first one online for a Zoom format. My name is Kaz Azevedo, and I'm a second-year MFA graduate student and coordinator of the series. I would like to thank our department chair, Annabeth Rosen, the series chair, Graham McDougall, and the Mann Edition for their continued support during our transition to our temporary online platform. We also owe a special thanks to Dean of Letter and we also owe a special thanks to the Dean of Letter of College and Science, Elizabeth Spiller, for providing core funding for our series. There will be a Q&A period after the lecture in which we will explain the process for submitting questions then. For now, your microphone and chat room will be turned off until this time. Beatriz Cortez is a multidisciplinary artist who builds machines that bring together different histories, acknowledge global and cosmic nomadism, and imagine the potential for divergent entities to coexist. I first met Beatriz last year in Los Angeles during the closing reception of her solo exhibition, Trinidad, Joy Station, at the Crafts Contemporary Museum. She gave an inspiring artist talk about stitching steel and imagining possible futures. Other solo shows in LA include Clock Shop, Vincent Price Art Museum, and Multidisciplinary projects. Beyond Los Angeles, the list of shows continues nationally and internationally in countries such as Colombia and El Salvador, where she was born. Her awards include the Arcadia Los Angeles Award 2020. The year before, she was awarded the Frieze Lifewtr Inaugural Sculpture Prize, which was scheduled to be unveiled this week as a part of free sculpture at Rockefeller Center in New York, but has been postponed due to the shelter in place. She holds an MFA in the California Institute of the Arts and a doctorate in Latin American literature from Arizona State University. She teaches in Department of Central American Studies at California State University, Northridge, and is represented by Commonwealth and Council Los Angeles. It is my honor to welcome Beatriz Cortez.
Thank you so much. Can you all hear me? Yes, perfect. Thank you so much for this introduction. I want to thank Kaz Azevedo in particular for coordinating all the logistics for what was to be my visit to the UC Davis art program and for what became this virtual lecture and my virtual studio visits this week. Thank you so much, and also to all the faculty in the department for all your work and for this generous invitation. And I want to thank all the artists who have made the best of this difficult situation and put together their work so that we could talk about it during my studio visits this week. I have completed half of these visits, and it has been a beautiful experience for me to spend time with each of you. So I want to thank you so much. And also to Professor and artist Graham McDougall for this invitation as well. I have been preparing for this presentation and writing about my work for a catalog for what was to be our show at the Wadis Art Institute. And instead, I'm writing from home, as many of you are at this moment under quarantine and during the middle of the COVID pandemic. When this crisis hit, I was in the middle of working on the construction, as Kaz was telling you, of this large-scale steel sculpture that was to be unveiled at Rockefeller Center yesterday. Some of my upcoming exhibitions got canceled. Among them, the group show at the Wadis that was to open in mid-April, the group exhibition at the Phoenix Art Museum that was to open in September. Other exhibitions got postponed, among them my solo show at Commonwealth and Council in Los Angeles, Frieze sculpture show at Rockefeller Center, my participation in numerous collective exhibitions at the following spaces: Sculpture Milwaukee for the summer, Galería La Única in San Salvador, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Panama, Descanso Gardens in Los Angeles, Cell Projects in London, Art in Residence and Outdoors Art Space in the Antelope Valley, and Tufts University. But what was truly difficult for me, mentally and physically, was to stop the construction of my sculpture, Glacial Erratic, which I will tell you more about in a moment. in the middle of the process when all the momentum and all the ideas were coming together in my mind and in my life on a daily basis. And even as I was exhausted physically, I was on a roll. And of course, the COVID virus brought with it a bit of a perspective, not only about how much artists put into their work, of our vitality and our energy, our life, but also what matters beyond everything else, life. I realized, among many other things, that I never before had really to stop making my work in the middle of making it, not only for my own well-being, but also for the well-being of others, because it was the ethical thing to do to stop making my work. Of course, stopping also brought with it the realization that the current context, as it interacts with the work, opens the work to the world even more than it was before. So I would like to tell you a bit about my work, but also to talk about some of the works and installations that were in the process and that were interrupted by the pandemic. In general terms, my work is about the memory of growing up in the Civil War in El Salvador and about the experiences of migration as I moved first to Arizona, where I lived for almost 11 years, and before coming to Los Angeles via Detroit, where I had my first job as a professor at Wayne State University. And my work is also about the experience of simultaneity, being into different time frames, living in two places at once, San Salvador and Los Angeles, existing in two or more, but different versions of modernity in different cultural worldviews, moving back and forth within different technologies, and more importantly, my work is about the future. I build memories so that I can imagine possible futures. And in order to do this, three concepts are central to my work: time, simultaneity, and movement. And I'm interested in how issues such as race, class, migration, or gender intercept or cut through those concepts. Time has become such a central concept in my work, particularly my effort to break chronologies, as a way to break colonialism too. So for instance, I didn't know this then, but when I reconstructed this miniature version of my childhood bedroom to make this video, my objective was to construct memory, to revisit a place that I had abandoned quickly and I didn't have a chance to document, to take a photograph, to take with me. But also it was about to talk about the passing of time, about lusciousness of life that continues to moving forward towards the past and towards the future. When I built a sculpture with soil and seeds that was meant to honor the unknown dead who have been thrown like trash in war and in migration, and I watered it every day until it became a garden, I did not realize that I was honoring someone who was not there at the moment. That is, I was crossing barriers of time and space, and I was already playing with the concept of the untimely. Looking back, a lot of my work was already thinking about crossing through time and space. I have built installations with books, installations that were about the memory of living in the war, about censorship, about violence, and about living in fear. And I began burning books and burying books, as people did with their own books when I was young and I was living in El Salvador in the middle of the war. And they censored their own books in order not to become targets of the violence. But I built those installations with the books that I have today in my library. And I hid the books that I thought would be banned today if the war happened in our context. And when I built an armor made of steel for Rufina Maya, a woman who was the only survivor of a massacre that happened in 1981 in the town of El Mozote in El Salvador, a day after I turned 11, I wanted to protect her in 1982 when she really needed the armor, and I wasn't able to make her one, and I wanted to protect her memory even though she's no longer here, and her testimonies continue unfolding through YouTube today without my help. The environment has been an important source of metaphors in my work as well. Even as I work with industrial steel, I'm gesturing towards returning this industrial material that has been artificially extracted from the earth back to the land. Building rocks with steel as an example of that gesture. However, it is through my work with plants that I have understood that our mark on this planet is not only written on the sedimentation layers of the rock or on the stone, but in the living environment. After all, a garden is an artificial arrangement of plants, a form of human interaction and intervention with cultural and historical content. Plants have allowed me to build metaphors about eugenics, about labor, about migration, hybridity, ancient knowledge, and others. For many years now, I have been exploring ideas of nomadism, movement, becoming, and spaces of blurriness and non-definition that fit the experience of the migrant. Queer theory, the Lucian philosophy led me to explore the Spinozian perspective on the vitality of joy, and other concepts such as entangled matters, porous bodies, trans-species, positionalities, destruction impacted my work as I read the work of Pierre Clastre, Rosi Braidotti, Karen Barad, Claire Colebrook, Peter Osborne, Emanuele Cocha, among many others. And from there on, movement became a central idea in my thinking, one that brought together my theoretical framework and my life experiences. Growing up in a war weighs heavily over my artistic practice, especially since it has not had a symbolic end, since there hasn't been recognition of what violence took place, no contribution on the part of those responsible, no justice. And so I have also been invested in building memory through my work. However, I build memory so that I can imagine possible futures and not so that I can solidify that moment in the past and go back there as a defining moment for my identity. My identity, I want to make sure continues in a process of becoming towards the future. So this is why the concept of time and the ability to intervene in the chronological order of time is central to my work. My understanding of time is informed by ancient concepts of time of the Maya and the ancient peoples of the Americas, such as the people of Teotihuacan, the Olmecs, the Aztec. Through my work, I strive to question the imposition of modernity as a way to imagine chronology towards a colonizing idea of progress and to impose a universal narrative of time. Ideas about speculative realism, the posthuman, philosophies of extinction, invited me to consider the imposition of seeing humanism, liberalism, or the Enlightenment as the only way, the colonial way to understand reason, and with it to understand time. Instead, I became interested in other ways of understanding time, circular conceptual constructions of time, multiplicity, simultaneity. For instance, I built a time machine with simultaneous capabilities that evoke the city of Los Angeles and the city of San Salvador with the same light. I projected a video of Los Angeles viewed from Griffith Park on the exterior panel of the piece, and I opened thousands of holes with different drill bits that allowed me to create a video with rudimentary technology for the night view of San Salvador in the interior space of the installation. So that if you go inside of the structure, you would be outdoors at night in San Salvador. I also built a memory machine with gears of different shapes and sizes that turned in circular motion. These were found gears that I collected in El Salvador, gears that were used to print pamphlets in the middle of the war. I built machines that had the ability to produce joy, but that did not produce anything from the perspective of capitalism. I began to experiment with play, and this is how I made the beast. This image that you see here, which is the top view of a pinball machine. The pinball machine that is now part of collection of works at El Paso Art Museum, brought back to life from an old abandoned playfield, rebuilt with both mechanical and Arduino technologies. Over here in this picture, you can see at the bottom, there's some of the relay boards that come with the Arduino. It showed a crumbling modernity underneath and a new version of modernity on top. It was a machine with a circular logic where a ball traverses a field marked by the obstacles of immigration, such as the Minutemen that you see here, the train called the Beast with the immigrants on top, the number of deported, the finding of the Zetas, the desert that you have to cross with the Saguaros. As much as the person playing attempts to keep the ball in the field, it is eventually expelled or deported from the field. But the machine is there ready for another try, and so the spectators continue to send the ball in and interact with the sculpture and collaborate collectively in keeping the ball in the play field, one effort at a time. And this piece, which engages with a history of migration and deportation, also examines through play the life of the immigrants impacted by chance and by forces outside of their control, and the number of times they are forced to improvise. I also made a fortune teller. This is a Cachiquel edition that I made in collaboration with Cajay Moloch, an indigenous Cachiquel collective in the town of Patsicía in Guatemala. We had been collaborating for years on several projects with them, more of academic projects and projects about the construction of memory. And I had asked them what they wanted for the future so that I could program their desires onto this machine. And I programmed them, and when you press the button, you get a ticket that says, when the future comes, there will be no genocide, for example. When the future comes, we will not be humiliated. And I realized that a lot of the desires in their responses were expressed in the negative, in a figure of lacking an expression of their particular context and the precariousness of their experiences. Here you see the box at the Cajay Moloch Museum in the town of Patsicía, and some images of the people of the town getting their fortunes written in Cachiquel and in Spanish. The Migrant Edition, for the Migrant Edition, I interviewed a group of immigrants and border crossers, a group of friends, and I asked them to share with me their desires for the future. Their interactive sculpture prints tickets that say things like, when the future comes, we will have met our relatives in person. This fortune teller is based on the idea that words have the power of willing the future into being. And it also follows some of the proposals of Rosi Graidotti and her invitation to imagine a collective becoming, because all of them are written in the future perfect in the plural form. So we will have survived. For instance, we will have been together. I also made a jukebox and several other pieces that were about play for this exhibition called Nomad World that at the Vincent Price Art Museum. All the pieces in the installation were about the simultaneous realities and the coexistence of different technologies in two or more places at once. And the jukebox then played soundscapes from Central America that allowed us to be in Los Angeles and yet be in Central America at the same time, and to move across space, to travel to another reality in spite of the migratory impediments, in spite of the borders, in spite of the economic hardships and other realities. The photo booth, which you see between these two walls where people are selecting some options, because you could post your photos in social media, you could select your background so that it would allow you to be in different places at once, began as an homage to undocumented immigrants who were unable to go back home to visit like everybody else and to take selfies and photos of in all kinds of places in Central America and Mexico. And so they were not able to participate in being home in this virtual space that links together our divided families, our divided lives. So seeing the public play with a photo booth reminded me that art, like play, can allow us to experiment with different ideas of space and time, jump through different moments in time, exist in different spaces at once, move around, be faster and slower, and so forth. Returning to the concept of time and to the experience of migration, I built an installation called The Cosmos. At the time, I began thinking about migration as part of my past, but also the cosmos as part of my future, and the idea that we could fragment our identity that we could imagine becoming other, that being an immigrant means that you can be here, and imagine becoming collectively with other people that are also here, another you or many versions of yourself, following Braidoti, or even imagine death as a future that is a way to be part of another becoming and not death as a terminal thing that was part of a trauma that I brought with me, rather death as part of a future that allows us to become part of the cosmos. And this is one of the ideas that I want to go back to at this moment of pandemic, but let me move forward a little bit more first. So my installation, The Cosmos, was about the fragmentation of identity, a future becoming that in some way was also death. And it was accompanied by the Untimely Conversations box that was a way about to go about breaking the chronological order of time, but also to establish untimely conversations with others who were not there because they had lived in a different time frame or they have lived in a different space. But it was in many ways a way to construct the idea of the contemporary, our contemporaries, the ones that think similar things to us, even if they don't live in the same space as we do, even if the contemporary are people who are in other time frames and in other spaces. Oops, sorry. So then I had my first experience working fully with steel. I had a residency at Cerritos College, and I was working in the auto body shop, which was an interesting experience for me, both in terms of gender and in terms of being there as an artist, but also being there as an educator, because at the same time that this space has the most amazing technology, it is a space that is meant to train people, many people of color, and mostly men, on how to become car mechanics, how to build custom car parts, use the latest type of technology available. And as you can imagine, I was interested in using vintage machines that were moved by my foot or moved by my arms, and that had less complicated technologies, and in many ways that I could imagine being used in El Salvador as well. And I was interested in also in putting together a huge structure made of steel that in many ways was made of custom. It was customly made, each of the pentagons and hexagons in the structure, but stitched together. Let's call it stitched together with zip ties. And so this installation, Your Life Work, was also a reflection about vocational school and what that meant and how it shaped dreams of the future and how it determined how students would imagine their future. So on the one hand, I shaped this structure that was called Black Mirror, a geodesic dome, the first geodesic dome that I made after the Cosmos, the first one that was made with steel, with these hexagons and pentagons, and I painted and finished it as if it were sorry. Somebody is not muted. Could I ask please to mute yourself if that's you? Thank you so much. So I shaped this structure, and then when I placed it in the space of the gallery, I was interested in thinking about it as a space that was at once inspired by this very contemporary idea of the car industry, but also about ancient constructions of mosaic mirrors made of obsidian, and ideas about time and about the future and about your destiny that came from indigenous cultures. And I placed a small note on the wall that said that in ancient Mesoamerican cultures, people built huge mosaics made of obsidian to tell your destiny. And so it was an invitation for people to look at the reflection on that structure and think about their destiny. But at the same time, at the entrance, there was an aptitude test box made of steel that was aging because it was on sealed steel. And when you press the button, you got tickets that were all inscribed within blue collar labor that said, when the future comes, you will be a great welder, you will be an electrician. If you don't mind the grease, you could be an inspector in an auto body shop, etc. And so, you know, it was also an effort to problematize what it meant to be in vocational school and to look at the history of vocational school and the Vocational Educational Act of 1917 and the way in which this country shaped its industrialized workforce. That same workforce that is, you know, heavily composed by immigrants today. This is an image of that structure last year at the in Miami during Art Basel. Next, I began thinking about extinction, and I began reading about the non-human and thinking about rocks, particularly because I was reading the work of Claire Colebrook, a thinker that has impacted my work enormously, a thinker that engages with the idea of disappearance and of the end of the Anthropocene and a time when humans disappear. And in many ways, a thinker that has helped me deal with this moment that we are in now. At first, when I started reading her work, I was super fascinated by the idea that the rocks were to become the archive that was going to hold the memories of humans moving through Earth. But also, I was interested in accepting her invitation to imagine a non-human geologists of the future that would be reading our mark on the planet, because these non-human geologists of the future that I imagine kind of like one of those rovers that are going through Mars would read the sedimentation layers, the rocks, the stones for traces of the Anthropocene, for traces of human life on the planet. But this geologist that was trained to read the layers on the rock would not have an easy job, because I imagined that lava came to my mind as a material that would confuse these geologists of the future and would blur the records, because would break the chronological order of time. Lava from the past would be spit out by a volcano, which is definitely a presence in every landscape that I imagine, and would change the order of the layers that write the temporal history of our passing through Earth, by spitting the past into the middle of this chronological timeline. And so this is how I began to explore different ways in which matter also breaks chronology. And of course, for me, lava had an important meaning, because lava was also the material that in El Salvador we identified as the killing fields, the place where people would go and look for the disappeared during my childhood. And El Playón, the huge lava field where many of the disappeared would be found. And so I built Cairn thinking about both those things. First outside the Brand Library in Glendale, but later here, as you see inside Rafa Esparza's figure ground beyond the wide field at the 2017 Whitney Biennial. It was a mound of stones serving as a landmark. I was interested in how it was an improvised form of construction that evoked the way indigenous peoples have built cairns for centuries to mark the way on the trail, to mark sacred ground, to mark a burial, or as other forms of landmarks, and how movable it was, that it wasn't about permanence, that you could build it here in the summer and move it somewhere else in the winter, that it was more about nomadism than about sedentarism. And so I was interested in the contrast between that idea and how within modernity a cairn is used to delineate private property or to trace the border between two nations. And at the turn of the 20th century in Los Angeles, I found this person that his name was Dan Montelongo, who had been building with river rocks. And he built many of the stone pillars that were part of the porches of craftsman houses in Los Angeles, in the neighborhood where I lived, but 100 years before me. And in this style that came to be known as LA vernacular style of architecture, this one that you see right now is made with rocks from Kettle Moraine, meaning they're rocks from the Ice Age Trail, rocks that could have been emerging from under the ice cap, and that as humans were not meant to see. But honoring Dan Montelongo for me became really important, because Dan Montelongo was also a symbol of how indigenous presence in the construction of Los Angeles and in this, sustaining Los Angeles during not only in ancient times or during the last 100 years is so important and is so invisible. And so I began to study the way that Dan Montelongo built, and I began to study his archives, and I began to think about how these structures were built. My interest in stones, this is one of the markers that marks the entrance to the Stonehurst district, where he built about 92 houses. So my interest in stones, in the greater lifetime that they have, in the long count of time in comparison to humans, in the ways that object-oriented ontologies made me pay attention to the work of a great master, Dan Montelongo. He was an Apache Mescalero stonemason who built more than 90 houses in what is now the historic Stonehurst district in Sunland by the 5 freeway in Los Angeles. He also built porches and fireplaces in houses in San Fernando, Silmar, La Crescenta, Glendale, Pasadena. So in the northeast side of Los Angeles. His indigenous way of constructing porch columns and fireplaces made me realize that what we call LA vernacular is a syncretic style where ideas about craftsman constructions and ideas about indigenous stone constructions coexist with colonial ideas about plantation architecture. Located, that's a photo of Dan Montelongo, by the way. Located inside and outside the home, the porch is both a public and private space. As part of the Los Angeles craftsman vernacular movement, the porch exists both inside and outside modernity. Its craftsman dimension meant that it was built with handcrafted details, meant as a way to resist industrialization and to bring beauty to daily life. It was linked to the back to the land and philosophy that encouraged the construction of buildings with local materials. And also it exhibited ancient indigenous ways of construction with rocks, evoking the foundations of the Templo Mayor built by the Aztecs, the Mayan pyramids, the Inca temples, or the Inca aqueduct spirals in Nazca, among others. While porches are often represented as part of a homogeneous American tradition, they have multicultural legacies that relate both to the history of slavery and slave labor in the construction of emerging towns and urban spaces, and also the history of colonization in the United States and in the Americas. It is a complex symbol. It can at once represent a space of cultural coexistence in contemporary California and a colonial legacy. It represents a history of resistance to industrialization and a space at the same time, a history of privilege. It opens a space for community interaction, but isolates the home as a space where that is not accessible for those foreign, undeserving, undesired bodies that don't belong in the interior space of the home. So this piece, the porch, was a piece about time warps, about gentrification, that replicates the porch of one of Dan Montelongo's construction, but this time made with industrial sheet metal, like a construction of a future without wood, without rocks, but a future with a nostalgia for those materials. Here you see the day when we were installing at OCMA, the Orange County Museum of Art, during the California Pacific Triennial. And at once a part of a beautiful home that was once built for the elites of the city of San Fernando, but that through the circular passing of 100 years came to be the home of a Lakota woman who enjoys on a daily basis the construction of an Apache man. And so I built the Lakota porch, a time traveler, as an homage to Dan Montelongo, but also as an homage to immigrants who today are the gardeners and domestic workers in houses such as this one. You see, I like to think that immigrants will one day own some of the houses that they clean today, some of the gardens that they keep today. On the other hand, I have always been interested in deconstructing the ways in which indigenous cultural production is pushed to the imagined past and erased from our imagined futures. So I wanted to build a space capsule that invites the viewer to imagine indigenous aesthetics for our future. It has a river rock fireplace in its interior, and I'll show it to you in a minute, as well as rock in its exterior. However, there are stones from another place, from another time, and it follows the same kind of idea and form of construction as the Lakota porch. However, here what you see is some images of the Popenoe Museum that was the home of Wilson Popenoe, the chief engineer at the United Fruit Company in Guatemala, and the brother of Paul Popenoe, the secretary of the Human Betterment Foundation and eugenics organization in Pasadena that seek to sterilize people of color and the poor and people who were ill, and to build a superior race. So in her book, The Death of the Posthuman, Essays on Extinction, Claire Colebrook argues that human beings are the authors of our own extinction due to our own desire to eat fats and sugars and to our overconsumption, and also to the destruction of the environment that we need in order to exist. For Colebrook, it is important to think of the possibility that humans are about to disappear and that the human era, the Anthropocene, is about to end. This is Wilson Popenoe as an agricultural explorer, by the way. Nevertheless, she reminds us that human beings are not necessary for the planet's existence, for the world to continue, that other eras without us had preceded us and other eras without us will follow. In terms of the time that the planet has existed, we have not been but a brief lapse in its history. It is from this perspective that I'm interested in thinking that humans are not necessary for memory to exist, that it is possible to think of a posthuman memory or a non-human memory, for instance, the memory contained in lava, the memory contained in plants. One day, Hammer Museum curators Erin Cristobal and Ann Elwood came to visit my studio, and in passing, Ann mentioned the ways in which my work connected to the work of Brazilian artist Maria Teresa Alves. Her comments made an impact in my practice because looking at Alves's work led me to reflect about all the knowledge and memory containing plants, the post-human world of plants, the non-human possibilities held in plants. Alves's project, titled The Seeds of Change, installed at the port in different European cities, including Bristol, Marseille, Liverpool, invites the viewer to reflect upon the legacy of colonialism through the displacement of plants, through their seeds traveling as part of the ballast or disposable materials that were discarded by the ships upon their return from the Americas and other locations to where they took humans to be sold and enslaved. Life in the dormant seeds remained latent for centuries, and artist turned gardener was able to germinate them once again in order to create beautiful gardens displaced from their socio-political histories, ancient indigenous plants growing in the European portal towns, a visible remnants of slavery. It was in part due to these reflections about Maria Teresa Alves's work that I began to think about the memory of plants, and in the particular case of migration from Central America, about how plants preserve the memory of a migratory experience that followed a very similar trajectory to my own migration. But it was also in the archives that the history of migrating plants impacted me profoundly. Let me close this because it's a little bright. Impacted me profoundly, especially when I realized that it was linked to colonialism and to a deep racism founded on white supremacy. A particular last name called my attention in the archives, Popenoe. I had been to the Casa Popenoe Museum in Antigua, Guatemala several times. It had been the house of Wilson Popenoe, director for over 25 years of the Pan American School of Agriculture, also known as El Zamorano, that the United Fruit Company established in Zamora, Honduras. It was in these archives in Los Angeles that I realized that the Popenoe last name not only evoked the Zamorano or the United Fruit Company, but also a history of racism and eugenics. Wilson's brother, Paul Popenoe, had served as secretary of the Human Betterment Foundation during the 1930s and 1920s in Pasadena, and it was an organization that advocated for the forced sterilization of many peoples. The Department of Agricultural Explorers was created as a way to produce profit from plants. But it migrated many plants from Central America to Los Angeles, including what we know now as the California avocados that you were seeing just now. So afterwards, Wilson Popenoe dedicated himself to the experimenting genetically with bananas in Central America and to transporting plants to California. Meanwhile, Paul Popenoe dedicated himself to experiment with humans. And when it was no longer very popular to be publishing articles in honor to Hitler, Paul Popenoe began to, he went to his plan B in the eugenics movement, and he formed the first marriage counseling office in Los Angeles. This is the location at 5287 on Sunset Boulevard by Sunset and Western in what is now Hollywood. And he would provide advice to married couples if they were from the same race to remain married and to continue to reproduce as a way to advance his agenda. But so I built the memory insertion capsule that you see here, both inspired by the work of Dan Montelongo and indigenous builders, inspired by Spanish colonial presence in the architecture of Los Angeles, by the craftsman architectural movement, by industrialization, but also by the history of eugenics. And I began to think about the ways in which the National Family Defense Fund in Hollywood and other spaces that provided room for Paul Popenoe to share his agenda, like, for example, he had reality TV and reality radio shows called Divorce Court and Can This Marriage Be Saved, a column that he had for 25 years in the Ladies' Home Journal. So the memory insertion capsule takes the form of a space capsule, but also brings together indigenous forms of architecture, what we call in Los Angeles, LA vernacular style of architecture, ideas about the Mayan glyph of zero, the machine eye that Colebrook talks about, and brings together a video loop in that eye where there's very rudimentary technology. Basically, it's just using an iPod and Google Cardboard placed there to see a video of the snippets of the archive in stereograph form, as if it were 3D technology of the 19th century. But let me move to the gardens before I finish, because I want to tell you a little bit about my gardens. This is a collaboration with Los Angeles-based artist Rafa Esparza. One of the great joys of my practice has been to collaborate with some of my friends, artist friends, so many times. And Rafa Esparza has definitely taught me so many things through those collaborations and inspired me enormously. This garden is made in the shape of a space capsule, a cosmic garden that preserved the knowledge of and culture of ancient indigenous peoples in the Americas for the survival and pleasure of humans of the future. Nomad 13 takes the form of an unconventional space capsule built of adobe bricks and steel. It houses a garden of plants indigenous to the Americas, evoking a long history of migrating plants cultivated by the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec civilizations. These species are known for their wholesome nutritional qualities and profound spiritual meanings. In symbolically sending these plants into the cosmos, Rafa Esparza and I evoked the real ongoing experiments of NASA aimed at growing fresh food for future space travelers, but also the crops were protected in their travels by xolots, those dogs that you see there, who are in the form of a dog are at once feared and loved, Aztec deities that guarded the sun as it traveled through the underworld every night, protecting also travelers as they move through the unknown territories, through space and time. In deep contrast with other ideas that I have heard a lot during this quarantine, the idea of the Victory Gardens, an idea that's more nationalistic and less about diversity and less a celebration of ancient cultures. This space capsule contains corn, black beans, prickly pears, sorghum, amaranth, quinoa, chayote squash, chia, chili peppers, yerba buena, yerba santa, sage, and a silk floss tree or a ceiba, which is behind the dog, and is a tree that the Maya considered a portal to the underworld. Another garden that we built together was a garden, an entire exhibition called Pasado Mañana Commonwealth and Council that we made also in collaboration, and we imagined together immigrant labor as a foundation for building a future in which multiple imaginaries of gender, race, class, and culture become possible. In Pasado Mañana, Spanish for the day after tomorrow, Rafa and I planted plants, planted gardens, but we also aim to help artists grow, to invite other artists to come to the gallery space and place their works alongside ours as a way to also reflect upon the idea that we are growing not only gardens, but our gardens are also our collaborations with younger artists who are our future. My piece was called The Argonaut, after Pacal, inspired by the lid of King Pacal's Palenque sarcophagus. It celebrates ancient technology in the field of agriculture. Water lilies and water gardens are the symbols of irrigation and his techniques to feed numerous people in Palenque. But also, of course, it was a metaphor about the ways in which Pacal was read as an Argonaut by archaeologists who did not believe that the Maya were talented enough to build the site of Palenque and thought that maybe some extraterrestrials had come to Palenque to teach the Maya how to build those amazing pyramids. These are some of the works there. And sulking, I will tell you very briefly about sulking. One of the things that to me was very important, that sulking was an homage to the Maya understanding of time, to the Maya calendar of agriculture, which is a calendar that also predicts people's destiny as a sort of horoscope. And also, sulking was about simultaneity. It's a structure that a double structure. One was in the LA River, the other one was at the Hammer Museum. And I was invited by Clock Shop to place this sculpture at the bow tie by the LA River. And I was really interested in the idea of the gaps that this sculpture would try to establish a conversation with the sculpture that was inside the institutional space at the Hammer, and that they wouldn't be able to really communicate or talk to each other, but that somehow their connection or their love would fill the gaps in a speculative manner, and that they would be able to communicate and sustain their connection. And so I installed these two pieces far away from each other, and thinking a lot about the simultaneity in terms of how the gears are moving in a circular motion, but also in a linear motion at the same time, and are drawing a circle and a line through their motion, and how that connected Maya's ideas about the construction of the calendar with more contemporary ideas in industrialization and the Industrial Revolution. So these are some of the images of that exhibition. and how the lives that these sculptures have had in other spaces later on. This one in particular is a virtual version of the sculpture that, thanks to the invitation by Nancy Baker Cahill, I was able to install at the Rio Grande, in the location where a Maya woman her name was Claudia Gomez Gonzalez, was murdered on the day when I was installing the sculpture by the LA River. And it was very painful for us to think about the fact that I was placing the sculpture to honor the Maya, but the Maya are not welcome here. And that a woman that was unarmed crossing the Rio Grande was murdered by the Border Patrol. So these are some of the images of the sculpture placed there virtually, and some of the images of my works in the outdoors by the bow tie, which has been an important space for me to explore the idea of thinking about work outside the institutional space of museums and galleries. And so I have oftentimes rented a truck, put all my works in the truck, put them together in the river, take photographs, spend time there, put them back in the truck, and take them home. But as I write these words, as I was preparing all these, my presentation for today, I was also thinking not only about this exhibition at the Craft Contemporary Museum, which is the exhibition that Cass was mentioning that several of the graduate students in the program at UC Davis were able to visit and where we met, but also, I am thinking a lot about immigrants, especially immigrants in their detention centers. This exhibition had an homage to them, especially because not only of the structures and the cultural contents of the work, but in particular because of this space of the beds that was called, they were cosmic beds that reflected the cosmos on the walls, but that were made with the materials that immigrants have in the detention centers, with mylar blankets, with chain link and steel. And I think, as we're dealing with the coronavirus pandemic, in the state of California has almost reached 40,000. The number of dead is also close to 1,500. So 40,000 people are sick. We don't know how many people are sick inside the detention centers. And we don't know how many immigrants are risking their lives because of being detained there. And it's definitely one of the thoughts that is very difficult to deal with for immigrants all over California. So how can we deal with so much death? Do we think of death as final? Do we imagine death as a way to transform ourselves, or as Braidotti states, our most important becoming, our opportunity to become different part of the universe? Of course, as death surrounds us, one issue that comes to mind is what will be left of us on this planet. What will remain of us humans? Who will remember our plights to survive? Who will learn about our migrations? When the pandemic began, it became clear to me that for us immigrants dispersed around the globe at different locations under the jurisdiction of different systems of biopower, my aunt in Spain, my family in El Salvador, my family in Canada, my loved ones in London, my family and friends in different Central American nations, in Mexico, and each of my family members in different states in the United States, are all going to have to deal with the regulations and lack of protections from different local and national governments. We are one multitude bound by love and separated by visible and invisible borders and systems of government. In the current context, all of our bodies are vulnerable to the novel coronavirus, but not all of them will react in the same way to the illness. Some will barely notice it, some will barely survive it, some will die from it. Some of our bodies will be cared for and cherished, while others will be treated like a virus themselves in these different national context. These disparities are a consequence of the wars that expelled us from our homes and dispersed Central American peoples throughout the world. For 3 or 4 decades, we have been cultivating our love, as I was telling you about the talking, under conditions very similar to the quarantine that we are experiencing today. Our love is sustained through the distance by the different technologies that we have had access to. Our family dinners, our birthday and celebrations, our difficult times have taken place while separated. Seeing each other through letters, phone calls, emails, video chats, or video apps. Our love has been filled with gaps, and these gaps have been filled with the speculative dimension of our love. I never imagined that I could come to see a time when everyone else would have to be separated from their loved ones in a similar way, finding creative ways to hold on to traditions, so many of us imagining mechanisms to be in several places at once. The sculpture that I was making when the crisis interrupted all our plans was called Glacial Erratic. It was a sculpture about how migration is planetary, migration is millenary, because it's about inspired in the idea that all these glacial erratics that are all over New York City, this one I photographed in Central Park, are rocks that were moved by the glaciers a long time ago, 18 million years ago, when the ice melted in the north and moved these huge masses of rock to different locations, in this case, Manhattan. And as they were exposed to the light and to the cosmic rays, the erratics were also touched by radiation, generating a process that documents their migration and the passing of time. Made of steel, this sculpture made of steel evokes an erratic as it invites the viewer to consider the long counts of time that are marked by the motions of the planet and the planetary nature of ancient migration, as well as the ways in which matter is marked by displacement and its interactions with the world around it. I tried to take in the lessons that the virus offers to teach us. There are so many that I can hardly process them in the short period of time since this began. The virus had made visible the vulnerabilities of the economy. It has dismantled the idea that consumerism is necessary for our survival. It has generated collective ideas about survival and distribution of labor, spontaneous collaborations across time and space, and heroic acts, particularly on the part of those who are facing the virus on a daily basis at the hospitals and medical centers. But today I want to listen to other lessons that the virus is also offering. Disembodied as it is, it has demonstrated that our bodies are porous, that we not only cross borders, but that also we share atmospheres. More importantly, the virus has turned humans into hosts. If we refuse to move, the virus cannot survive beyond us. It requires our motion, our interaction, our gathering to jump in exponential numbers across entire populations. But without our motion, the virus can only run its course and either destroy our human bodies, their hosts, or disappear, leaving our bodies transformed. Its genetic code inscribed into our system under the label of antibodies. The virus, with its animal genetic code, is transforming human genetic code. We're crossing species and becoming animal, becoming cyborg, becoming other. Thank you. Thank you for your patience with this lecture also, and let's move to the questions and answers.
Yes, thank you very much, Beatriz. That was wonderful. We will go ahead and open the Q&A. There should be a part on your Zoom platform that you will be able to raise your hands. There is a portion about that. Or you can also submit I'll open the chat box now. You can submit your questions through the chat box or raise your hand and we'll call upon you. Yes, that was wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
We're just waiting for those to come in.
So people can type their questions in the chat room or make questions or ask questions via video. Is that it?
Yes. I believe. The chat box should be open. Oh, I have a question right here.
Okay, I don't see any questions in my box, but go ahead.
Wrong. Rachel, are you with us?
I am with you. Hi, Beatriz. Hi, Kaz. Thank you. You said there's so much that you said. I took so many notes, and my question may just pale in comparison. But I just wanted to ask sort of a two-part. For your PhD studies, what did you study? And then as a graduate student in the UC Davis program, and as somebody who thinks about continuing my education afterwards, and with this concern myself, is I wonder what effect doing those studies had on your practice.
I think everything I have done has had an impact on my practice. And I think everything we do, including this moment of pandemic, has an impact on our practice. And I think it's important to value each one of the things that life gives us in the same way, you know, because everything comes with important messages and lessons. But when I studied for my PhD, I studied literature of Latin America, but I was in Arizona in the Spanish program, a program that specialized on queer theory, and at a moment when queer theory was being written. And so it was an exciting moment because a lot of the theorists, the philosophers that were thinking about non-definition and about identities that are blurred, identities that are in the making, in many ways connected with other philosophical traditions that became really important to me later on. For example, a Deleuzian tradition that's more about becoming and about movement, but that connects so much with queer theory because both of them are not interested in solid, rigid definitions of identity, but rather in the movement. So it's all about becoming and not about being. And that's an important concept for me that allowed me to think about living in a war, for example, or my experience of migration, not as something that defines my identity, but as something that defines my future. And I think also that in many ways it has led me to build my sculptures with philosophy as much as with steel and as much as with other materials. But I think it has been complicated for me because it has also led me to pay attention to the times, you know, when sometimes viewers read my work based on my identity as opposed to really listening to what the work might be saying. So, but I think that in many ways, when I went back to school, especially at CalArts, I spent a lot of time reading Deleuzian scholars and thinking about other moments in philosophy that also informed my work later on. So I think just to keep reading is what has been really interesting for me. Thanks for your question, Oran.
Thank you so much.
Yes, we have another question from Christina McPhee. If you'd like to ask your question, I can unmute you.
Oh, okay.
Hi, Christina.
Hi, hi. So wonderful to hear your long form discussion here. I'll just read the question. I'm just thinking, it occurred to me as I was listening to you discuss the idea of the non-human future geologist, kind of coming out of your common ground with Claire Colebrook. I was wondering if you've thought about this virus itself as being some sort of future, symbolically, I mean, as a future geologist. Have you thought about plugging in the coronavirus typology into that imaginary?
No, I mean, that's a super interesting question, but I have not thought about it as future geologist, because I am thinking about the virus as a very present being, and I'm interested very much in the idea that, you know, it crosses through bodies, and it takes us to cross through species, because
yeah.
you know, in many ways, it leads me to some of the writings that Deleuze and Guattari left for us about the virus, especially when they're talking about the rhizome in 1,000 Plateaus. They talk about the virus, and they say that virus is a way, they're not thinking obviously about the coronavirus, they're thinking about Spanish flu or other pandemics, but they're saying a virus is a way to jump species, and my virus allows me to become a rhizome. And, you know, in many ways, what I think that says is that it's an invitation for us to, rather than mourn the loss of our humanity, to embrace our becoming animal. Mm-hmm. And I think that's an interesting way to read this moment that is so difficult for us, you know. So I've been thinking a lot about, obviously death makes it so difficult, but how to imagine death in other ways, and how to imagine the virus in other ways has been a way to deal with this moment.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for being here.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Pablo, you had a question about materials. Let me get you unmuted here.
You're
Thanks. Hi, Beatrice. I have a studio visit with you tomorrow, so I'll see you. I'm one of the grads here.
Hi, Javila.
Hi. But everyone's been asking such great intellectual questions, and I guess mine is more going way to the physical side. I just, in terms of materiality, wanted to ask how you feel about metal.
Well, I wouldn't say that I don't have any feelings towards materials, but I do think that metal has content, and I'm super interested in that content, that at once is about industrialization, it's about the way that we understand the city of Los Angeles as, you know, we think of steel as the most solid, durable material, the way that steel plays a role in the car industry, etc. And at the same time, the way that steel comes from the earth, and if I don't paint it, crumbles, and it becomes this obsolete modernity very quickly. So I'm interested in how steel can occupy all those different spaces. But also I am thinking definitely about Holbrook's work, about the end of the Anthropocene, and the idea that we're destroying the planet. We're being left by our own doing, without the materials that we use to work, you know, without wood, without rocks, without all these materials that are part of our environment. And so I also use steel as a way to imagine a nostalgic approach to materials that are no longer there. And I also am interested in the way in which steel workers, you know, this idea that being a steel worker represents in the history of the United States, especially in the context of World War I and II, but also, you know, in terms of the construction of gender and how to warp those ideas.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to visiting your studio tomorrow.
We do have time for another. Crystal Perez, would you like to ask your question that you submitted? You should be unmuted.
Thank you for being here, Crystal.
Hi, Beatriz.
Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. So my question was, how are you able to like straddle like the like affective quality of like these moments and people that you somewhat like pay homage to and bring them into the aesthetic realm? Like, if that makes sense. If it doesn't, I can be more clear.
Yes, tell me a little bit more.
Like, and I asked this, and I guess maybe as like someone who recently graduated undergrad in art, and so like how bringing like these like really kind of or like really kind of vulnerable people and vulnerable events, or even like topics like people in like detention centers, and how are you able to like bring these into like in your art practice? That's the question, if that makes sense again.
Yeah, I mean, if I'm understanding correctly, that I'm bringing the stories of all these immigrants and my own stories to this space that you're calling the aesthetic, but to me it's at once aesthetic and conceptual. And I think that in many ways, to me, it's about trying to imagine possible futures as a way to survive, all of us together, but also as a way to bring joy and hope to the present, a present that's very difficult, especially for immigrants, and a way to step away from indifference. So while my work is quite industrial and filled with philosophy and very conceptual, it's also very much present in the lives and the plights of immigrants and what they're experiencing today, you know, at this time when they are in great numbers, the essential workers that are risking their health to be outdoors and to make sure that we have food on the table.
Got it. Thank you.
But you wrote a different question on this chat, so.
It was like essentially the same thing. I don't know if I like phrased it.
Oh, okay. All right. I just wanted to make sure that I answered your question.
Thank you.
Thank you, Crystal.
Yes, thank you. Julia Rigby, you have a question for Beatriz?
Yeah.
Hi, how are you? Thank you so much for your talk. I had a quick question, and then also I realized Zena has a question. I'll ask mine super quick so we could have time for more, but I was wondering about your use of steel in making rocks. So you're talking about rocks as like markers of our like histories and our collective humanity histories, but again with the steel as like, you know, something of industry and a new material, can you just speak a little bit about that? I'm fascinated by that idea.
I think I came to the realization that I had to make rocks with steel because I was thinking about as I was saying, the idea that the materials that we now have available are going to also be gone. And that I was imagining a future when we no longer had these materials available. So I was trying to make them. So in some kind of nostalgic way, I was making wood siding from steel, and I was making rocks from steel. And that was super interesting because, you know, everyone I asked to help me, because every time I make something, I at first I wasn't even trained in welding. Every time I have worked on a piece, I basically improvise the labor that is required to make that piece. And it's a way for me to honor the immigrants that work in different industrial processes without being trained, because that's their way of surviving. And so I started making rocks with steel without knowing how to make rocks with steel. And most people said I can't make rocks with steel. And another artist who was working in my studio, and right now still working in my studio, she's this great artist, Carla Canseco. She's like, we can make rocks. And I think there was something interesting for me about our conviction that rocks could be made out of steel, because the way that we made the rocks was I was always imagining that we were seamstresses, that we would cut darts, that we would beat the rocks into, working as if we were making the shoulder blade for a blazer or things like that. And so I think, also that improvised way of construction was important for me in the process of working with steel, so that I have always been very careful about making the structures well, making them safe, but also stepping outside codes of construction that impose modernity on the pieces by improvising or making sure not to be trained properly on how to do something and just trying to figure it out. So it's also a note to the intelligence of the migrant workers that are able to figure it out on their own how to make things.
Thank you. If it's okay, we'll wrap up.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Do we have time for Zena's question?
Yes, I was going to say we can wrap up with Zena's question. Zena? Go for it.
Thank you so much. I have a question that's pretty, actually, kind of basic, because it's a part of your personality. You generally, I could already imagine you in the classroom as like very inclusive person with all of the students and everyone around you. It's a part of who you are, is like just the relationships that you build. You honor them and you collaborate with them, and so much of that work has you've notated how that has only fed your work rather than taken away. And I think that that's like a significant part of the art world, as we working together only helps us all out as a community rather than taking away. And it's very, like the way that you're working opposes the individualism of thinking, of working alone, and like an American mindset of individualism. So I was wondering if you could expound on that. I don't know if that's just a good question, but like how you approach collaboration and how you approach art making, and how that has, I don't know, carried you.
I think that's a really important question, because collaborating is not easy.
It's not easy, yeah.
And it's not what we're taught to do all the time. And so I really appreciate that question. In fact, one time as I was collaborating with Rafa, or I have been collaborating with Kang Song Lee, for example, on several occasions, when somebody asked me if I could collaborate with an artist that I didn't know, I said, I don't know if I can. I have to know this person. And the reason is that I think that sometimes, when you're collaborating with someone, you have to know that you're going to be able to, that you share a similar vision about something that you can say together. And also that it will be okay with you if your labor is confused with their labor.
And
that's
a very important part, I think.
I think it's a very important part. And so, there have been times when, I remember the first time that Rafa and I made a sculpture, somebody came and said, Rafa, I didn't know you were welding. Beatriz, your plants look beautiful. And Rafa and I were laughing because I had made the sculpture in steel, and my friend Elizabeth had grown the plants, because she's the gardener in the studio who builds all the gardens, because gardens require constancy and people who are in town. And I'm never in town, and my gardens would die. So I always have my gardens, but I take them to Elizabeth And I think, you know, all those experiences led me to think a lot about how I am okay with my labor being, I'm honored if people think that what I did, Rafa made, that's amazing, you know, and if people think that my work with Kang Sung Lee is confused, like if they're confused by what, it's like, for us, our answer is always, it's ours. And people ask us all the time, which part did you make? And that's not important, because there's an effort here that's also conceptual to build collective subjectivities that are aimed towards the future. And so credit is not necessarily part of that. So, and I have a lot of text that people are writing here, and I don't really have the ability to speak and read it, but if maybe Cass can help me catch up with some of these notes.
Oh, I'm sorry, I was like checking my time.
Oh,
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, thank you.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you very much, Beatriz, for all your time and your great lecture and your great words. We have enjoyed you so much, and we appreciate you very much. At this time, I think we can go ahead and wrap this up and end it now.
Would you mind leaving the window open for a moment so I can respond in the chat to a couple questions that I'm receiving?
I will. I will. Yes, we will go ahead and
thank you so much, all of you, for your patience and for your interest. And I'll see you soon.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we do have. Are you able to see the chat box, Beatriz?
Jose Chavez had a question about gardens and my relationship to gardens.
Sure. Jose, you with us?
Yes. Thank you.
Hi, Jose.
Hi, Beatriz.
Yeah, I think gardens are super interesting because they have the, you know, some people recreate their home, and so many of them are also migrating gardens, and that's super interesting. Mm-hmm. And also, one of the, you know, Rafa and I have talked a lot about gardens. Rafa used to be a gardener with his dad when he was like in high school. And so, you know, for us, it has been part of our reflection about gardens in Los Angeles to think about how so many times they're about status, so many times they're about wealth, but other times gardens are about, you know, peace and about culture and about migration and about nurture. And I'm really interested in the politics of the gardens too, because as I was saying about the Victory Gardens, there used to be a regulation that required people to plant their food during World War II. And when the war ended, it was illegal to plant your food because they wanted people to go to the supermarket and pay taxes. And so it's also interesting how, you know, you see all the time of these regulations that say things like, in this neighborhood, you can only have flowers, but nothing that can be edible. And edible plants are beautiful too. And so we're trained to think that a rose is a valuable gift, but not a corn plant, you know? And so all those things are really interesting for me to think about. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yeah. And you had answered it a little bit before earlier as well, when you had mentioned that authorship wasn't very important to you in a certain sense, at least when like maintaining those gardens that you create, and how you're interested more in creating a collective future as well. And that was also very helpful. Yeah,
and also, I mean, as we're planting plants that are indigenous to the Americas and that are plants that ancient peoples left for us, sometimes at great expense. I mean, the Spaniards, in some cases, would chop off people's hands for planting quinoa or corn because those plants were sacred to them, and they wanted, you know, other religions to go away. Those plants are healthy, nutritional, they're gluten-free, they're, you know, they're going to make us survive in the future. So I also take them as a great gift of generosity from ancient peoples in the Americas to us. And I think about how it's our turn to preserve them and to celebrate those plants so that other humans of the future that we will never meet can also enjoy them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Jose.
Nice to
I
meet
have
you.
another message from Ana Andrade.
Is Anna, you still with us?
If not, I think I need to copy her message because she's asking me something that about, I'm gonna just write it down. And then, oh, thank you all for your comments. I think we're done with the questions.
I believe so. We can go ahead and end this now.